Welcome to the Bionicle Inspiration Series. Today, we're going to be talking about some Bionicle mocks from the Bionicle community, but we always focus on one specific theme with the Bionicle Inspiration Series, whether that's arm designs, leg designs, how to build Star Wars mocks, whatever. And today, what we're going to focus on is color schemes. And this is bringing back a sort of slightly older kind of sub-series. It's not even quite the right word, but I essentially want to cover a whole bunch of different colors and mocks that primarily use that color, and so we can see what colors complement each other well. We can just focus and narrow in on one specific color, and of course today that color is the color white. And so what we want to see is what white can sort of symbolically show or mean, and hey, maybe you've got a whole bunch of white pieces in your collection. Well, if you do, now's the time to put them to good use. Let's see how a bunch of mocks use the color white, and of course how you too could use the color white in your own creations. So as I do in all of these sort of more color-focused episodes, where I just narrow down on one color, I look up a Google definition of the meaning, the symbolic meaning behind the specific color. So this is what Google says when I ask, hey, what does the color white symbolize? So Google says, white, an inherently positive color. It is associated with purity, virginity, innocence, light, goodness, heaven, safety, brilliance, illumination, understanding, cleverness, faith, beginnings, sterility, or being sterile, spirituality, possibility, humility, sincerity, protection, softness, and finally, a perfection. So, some pretty well-rounded stuff. There's genuinely kind of a really strong sense of kind of lightness and almost a sort of sense of like being angelic or sort of otherworldly, ethereal, sort of very sort of positive, otherworldly vibes. And I like that a lot. And I think we're going to see a fair few mocks that represent that. So we'll keep all of those different elements in mind, and I'll say which ones apply to the specific mocks that we talk about. So let's talk about those mocks. The first mock we've got today is by Anthony Wilson, and it's called The Radiance. So picking apart the specific meanings we spoke about before, I certainly think that this mock has elements of purity, light, goodness, heaven, safety, brilliance, a bit of illumination, good amounts of faith as well, beginning, spirituality, and perfection. So why do I think that these random words relate to this mock? Well, we look at it, and it essentially looks like some sort of video game or religious god of sorts. It naturally has that sort of angelic look to it. It has wings like you might find on an angel. It almost has a sort of crest, implying that it has some sort of, crown or decoration on its head that implies a sense of importance. And so those things I spoke about before, kind of goodness, heaven, faith, spirituality, all those sort of different elements there, it really paints it in this light of being very powerful, very strong, very magical almost, like it sort of would have some sort of magical power, And I like that. And how does white relate to that? Of course, well, obviously white has all of those qualities, but also white, typically when we draw angels, depictions of some sort of angel, whether it's from a religion or from a whole bunch of other random things, we have them in white robes of sorts, So using white here very much helps to convey that very strong sense of being almost godlike, having a lot of power, being this sort of patron or religious icon, The description here on this mock says, "Open your mind, little one." And as we take a closer look at this mock here, we can see some of these sort of floating round little rock panels. And there's a little itty-bitty tiny little knight standing on one of them, just a little micro-scale figure built with some smaller system pieces there. And he's holding a little spike piece there as if he's holding up a sword. So, I kind of get this story that this, maybe you're playing a video game and you have to approach this god and he can bless powers onto you and you level up in the game, you become stronger, That's the sort of sense that I get from this, and I love it. So, of course, the white very much helps with that, especially the choice of some of the textures on these white pieces. They have these sort of very flowing, long kind of curves to them, almost like some sort of flowing angelic robe or a bit of cloth. They're very sort of smooth and peaceful. There's nothing necessarily kind of hard or rugged about the textures on those white pieces, so it helps to convey that essence of being good, heavenly, safe, brilliant, all those words we spoke about before. Additionally, as well, I also like the inclusion of, I touched on it before, the kind of wings on this mock. You know, they're silver and they complement it nicely, but the angles of these pieces are all sort of pointing upwards, similar to that kind of crest on the top of its head that I mentioned as well. The fact that they're kind of all pointing up, and again, they're a bit more sort of smoother in nature, those pieces, it kind of does give you this sense of, you know, when we ask, you know, where's heaven, or that sort of thing, we normally point up. That's kind of where we picture it to be, you know? And I think the essence of the textures and the lines on this mock kind of pointing upwards, again, kind of implies this sense of being more angelic, otherworldly, good and positive, you know? And so I like that. I like that a lot. I think Anthony, that's one of the reasons Anthony's so good. He very much pays attention to the colors he's using, the textures he's using, how he places pieces, and what that can also sort of represent and show. And I think, you know, really paying attention to those specific elements really can elevate a mock. No pun intended there. Can really elevate it and make it even cooler. You know, it's pretty cool. I also like this little stand as well, the beautiful contrast between the black and the white there, and how the black and the grey areas there do have this sort of more inky, evil look to them. So it very much elevates the look of the mock as well. I also like, too, the little bits of editing he's done, just applying this sort of little bit of this kind of yellow light behind it, as if it's sort of emanating a glow or a sort of good, godly aura. You know, it's pretty cool. And again, it applies to some of the symbolism we were talking about before. So, hey, I like that. That's pretty cool. If you want to build some sort of god or angelic-like character, aiming for some white is definitely the way to go. So, let's move on to another mock. This one's by Gringat the Repugnant, and it's called Science Isn't About a Why. It's about why not. So Gringat is a pretty cool builder. I do love this man, and he's built a fantastic mock here. So what sort of stuff do I think relates to this from some of the words we spoke about before? I think there's certainly elements of purity, bit of innocence, understanding, beginnings, the sterile aspects we were talking about before, and a nice softness as well. So why do I think all of that? Well, typically when we see like laboratories or things relating to science, they're often white in nature, kind of implying this sense that it's clean. You know, nothing's going to get infected if the science is dealing with, you know, health-related things. It's clean, it's all protected, all that sort of stuff, you know? So introducing a little bit of white in that regard can certainly relate because, you know, white's typically a color you see around, you know, medicine, doctors, hospitals, all that sort of stuff, you know? And so the fact that the name of this mock implies the sense that this is some sort of crab, lobster-like creature that's been experimented on with science and made to have weapons and all sorts of other crazy robotic elements. I think the inclusion of white there certainly makes sense because it does continue that sort of trend of science, you know? I also think, again, paying attention to some of those textures, the choice of using those harpoon elements for the sort of the feet for this creature here, the choice of having a lot of kind of wires and ropes and things, and the repeated pattern of those dishes that forms the eye on this little cute creature here. Those textures all have that sort of more mechanical, robotic enhancement kind of look to them. And I think it, again, kind of feeds into that sort of science element of this, you know? I just think this guy has a bit of a sense of kind of cuteness and curiosity to him. I think the fact that he just has this very large one mono eye for his head does make him look kind of cute and adorable. Plus, he's tiny, and tiny things are always pretty cute, you know? So, yeah, I think that works really well. Some other things that I would think works really well. I love some of these ingenious part usages that Gringat's put on here. The inclusion of those Ninjago sword bases that came in one of the most recent waves of Ninjago. I don't think it was the most recent wave. Well, it depends. By the time this episode comes out, some newer Ninjago stuff's coming out, you know? So, harder to say exactly when, but the video game inspired Ninjago sets. The swords had hilts on them that were essentially like video game consoles, but you could kind of grip them in a manner and attach things to them so that they actually were, you know, sort of swords themselves. And using them here works really well. Again, it kind of plays into that science element of them because they have that sort of plus pattern to them. It just looks more mechanical, science-y, for lack of a better term. And partnering that there with that Rebel Trooper helmet, that's a really nice combination, and it makes for this really interesting looking artificial sort of lobster claw of sorts. It's really cool. It's really, really cool. So no, Gringate, you've done a fantastic job here, and I think, again, very deliberate choice of putting in white to kind of reflect those more sort of science elements. Always good to have a bit of meaning behind the color that you, the colors that you put into your mocks. So, great idea. Now, let's move on to probably one of my favorite mocks this year. I really like this one. This is by Jafer, and it's called Taito. I'm going to assume that's how you pronounce it. But the description here details this as the guardian spirit of the woodlands. This is awesome. This is really, really cool. I'll briefly touch upon some of the kind of qualities that I think the white in this is bringing out, and that's elements of purity, innocence, certainly a sense of goodness as well, definitely a sense of brilliance. I mean, just looking at it, it just has this beautiful, brilliant quality to it, and also a nice softness as well. Now, obviously, the softness because he's made of feathers, and, I'm sure if he gave you a big hug, it would be very comforting, like a dog's hugging you or something, Or in this case, an owl-dog-cat combination thing with reindeer antlers, I think it's a beautiful, brilliant combo. I think, if I remember correctly, Jafer was inspired by just sort of an image he found online. I assume it was some sort of, like, homunculus animal from some sort of fantasy concept art or something, but it essentially was this, and Jafer's recreated it in Lego form, and it's one, just a really cool character concept, and two, utilizes some pieces in some brilliant ways, which let's talk about, So obviously the kind of major element of this mock is all the different kind of wing or kind of fur elements. So those wing pieces came on some Chima sets, those wing pieces that are specifically being used on the actual wings of this mock. But there are also some wing elements being used on the face here. They're slightly smaller wings that were used for some of the Chima minifigures. Some of those larger wings were more used on the different vehicles and things as well. So again, multiple different wing elements. And then some of these sort of fur elements in white, which again were used on some of those Chima Ultra build sets. So the CCBS Chima sets that did actually come out. Those were pretty cool. I think there's a few other sets too that did come with those larger fur pieces that are there on the sort of torso neck area. But, hey, we'll for the most part just say all these wing pieces are from Chima sets because they are. And I think that's super cool. The different textures of them makes it feel, again, we spoke about angels before. It feels very angelic. It feels very cute and cuddly and furry. And he looks like a very, peaceful, respectful guardian of the woodlands, as he spoke about before. And I don't know, just, it's like, I don't know, at least for me, whenever I see an owl, and you can often sort of see owls in different kind of myth, legend, and folklore and stuffs, as being, very wise, very noble, very, I don't know, I guess kind of like guardian-like creatures as well, And I think, giving it this white color scheme, because obviously owls can have different colors. They can be more sort of black or gray, but deliberately picking the white here definitely, I think, kind of adds to that sense of kind of mythic and legend that I think this mock kind of conveys. I almost can imagine this, just from that one little word of description, how it said, the guardian spirit of the woodlands. I can almost imagine walking around in some sort of medieval fantasy forest and you get attacked by wolves and this guy suddenly just appears and rescues and saves you, And it would just be this amazing tale that you would tell people. You'd be like, I don't even know what happened. It was amazing, And I think there's just this beautiful mythic quality that comes across with the choice of white, because it makes it feel just like those words we spoke about before, this innocence, this goodness, this brilliance, this softness to it. I think it really helps with creating this just really unique and beautiful look that, to me, inspires levels of storytelling, levels of just beauty and myth. It's just really cool. It's just really, really cool. Great to see the white coupled with some tan as well. I think that's a brilliant color combo. And again, tan is a color that's quite close to white on the kind of color spectrum as well. For the most part, you could just say tan is a sort of, darker version of white. So it makes sense that those two colors would work well and communicate very similar things. It's really cool. I also love the inclusion of that bush element, which you can see being used on the legs there. It's just a typical system bush. You find those in different plant-related sets there. And it kind of continues that kind of furry, feathered look as well on the legs there. Really, really nice part use. final thing I'm going to say about this mock, and then I must move on because otherwise we'll be here all day. I really like this, is the antlers here. So those antlers, of course, are a much darker color, and just the kind of general shape of them does look very sort of menacing. It almost looks like some sort of leafless forest that you would walk around at night in some sort of haunted area, and all the different branches on the trees almost look like large fingers that are about to grab you or poke you or stab you or whatever. Looks like some sort of, scary looking branch of sorts, And I love that coupled with just the beauty of this mock and the large sort of good mythic angelic look that it has. The sort of more sort of sinister antlers like that actually start to not feel as sinister and instead look more mythic and more pure and good. I think it's just really interesting how you can juxtapose those two things with each other, and by having this mock be like 80% sort of fluffy, cute, cuddly, positive, and good, if you do put some of those elements in there that could be more associated with something a little bit more sinister and evil, it kind of gets drowned out with the much larger angelic look that this mock has. Just interesting to note, if you are putting something into a mock and it's not quite working, can you instead increase something that you do want to be working and complement the two together in that sense so that they're not conflicting in that sense, I think that's really cool. I think it's really clever. Just a phenomenal mock, Jafer. Love your work. Let's move on to another mock by a different builder, Alex Park Designs. This one's made by, and it's called Joannis, the Keeper. So again, this one has some fairly similar qualities to the last one we saw, but it's a little bit different to a degree. So this, I think, has elements of kind of brilliance, illumination, faith, and to some degree protection. He kind of looks like a bit of a guardian, So, the last mock had wings, and to some degree this mock does as well, but they're a very sort of different style of wings. Sometimes you build a mock and you go like, I want to put like wings or like jets or something on its back just to add something extra. Just like maybe the mock's just missing something. But maybe wings aren't really fitting for the mock, And so I love the idea of putting something on the back of a mock just to give it that little finishing touch. But instead it's this really obscure sort of series of rings, It may not have any sort of practical use, but it just looks cool. And it certainly gives this mock this godlike, guardian-like, ethereal quality to it. Very similar to what we spoke about before, but certainly different to what we spoke about before as well. Both of them have this sort of, ancient, godlike look to them, but this one looks almost sort of futuristic, almost otherworldly, whereas the other one seemed a little bit more, I don't know, Jafer's mock seemed more grounded in myth and legend, whereas this seems futuristic. I don't know, they're different. I can't quite put that into words, if I'm honest, but they share very similar qualities, but do it in a very different way. I think that's super cool. So the white is a little bit more minimal on this mock. If anything, the black is more the predominant color. But of course, black and white, ebony and ivory, they work really well in unison there. So that's always nice to see. And certainly if you're planning to build a mock that features the color white, throwing in a bit of black there is never a bad idea either. And especially if it's just a subtle bit of white here as well, like we see here, just using these larger kind of ring pieces, and a few other little tiles and different things as well. Very subtle, very minimal, but really helps to get the job done and really helps to communicate that kind of ancient, unique sense of brilliance and faith and protection that I think that this mock really does pack in. It's really, really cool. One little subtle bit of white that I really like on this mock is on the lower arms, the just sort of on the kind of elbow area. You can see that he's used one of those socket pieces that transitions into a place where you could insert an axle. And normally those pieces typically have that sort of band of white on them. You can just sort of see it there. And it's just really interesting because often, if you do include that on any mock, you're going to have that band of white unless you find a way to cover it up. But I like that Alex actually hasn't covered it up. And now there's just that little extra hint of white on the arms here. Very subtle, very unique, but it works well. And it's nice to see that part being played for an advantage, and instead of being like, just ignore that little bit of white, he's gone, no, actually, focus in on that. It's a part of this mock. It's a part of the design. It's really cool. It's really, really cool. So that's kind of all I'll speak about for this one here. Really unique and great to see white just very subtly used. You don't have to use it as a predominant color, of course. Really nicely done. This next mock is by Vero, and it's called Niran. So another more angelic mock. Some of the more angelic mocks we spoke about before, yeah, they were very sort of, certainly very complex. They used some more in-depth building styles and things. But instead, this character design here is a little bit more sort of Toa-like, a little bit more of just your sort of typical humanoid, which, I know a lot of the people who watch this show, that's the sort of stuff they themselves build. It's just a more sort of, just a typical humanoid, not branching out, doing anything too crazy or different. But there's still a really nice place for that. And again, I don't want to diminish this mock by saying that. I think it's very well designed. I think it looks fantastic. But it's always nice to just see, hey, here's a very sort of run-of-the-mill, typical normal way that you could still use white and build a really solid, really well-designed humanoid character that is a little bit more sort of Toa-like, for lack of a better term, So again, we see more angel wings, certainly white really shining forward with that sort of more angelic look to it. But also, I definitely think there are elements of purity, light, goodness behind this mock. Heaven as well, of course, like we spoke about with being angelic in nature. Again, it shares fairly similar qualities with some of the stuff we've spoken about before. But I think it's just nice to remember that, yes, we're speaking about having, heaps of symbolism packed into your mocks and really focusing in on detail and not placing a piece unless it has a specific purpose or the textures communicate something. But sometimes it's just also nice to really factor in, hey, just use white to communicate, hey, they're an angel, and I'm still just going to build a fairly, really solid, well-designed Toa here, even though I think the description doesn't actually mention this as a Toa specifically. But, it's got some prefab limbs and other elements there. Got a nicely designed overall sort of torso there. The hips, of course, have a more sort of feminine look to them, using some of those Hero Factory elements there to sort of buff out the hips there as well. It's really nicely designed. And overall, just a really, really solid mock, I also want to briefly point out the weapon here. I like that it is this sort of larger staff. And I don't know, typically when you see kind of godlike or angelic characters, they actually normally have staffs as their weapons. So, hey, if you're building one, that might be something to implement into your angelic kind of godlike character. But also at the same time, I think that's just very fitting here and really heavily complements this mock. Typically when you see a weapon on a mock, it can sometimes just be a kind of random choice. Like, yeah, I wanted to give them a gun, why not? But yeah, I think it actually takes some pretty nice skill to really give a mock a weapon that complements its sort of overall look. And actually sort of says something about the character as well. I think this is a nice example of that. Again, a very subtle example, but still a really, really nicely designed and, personally, from my opinion here, I think looks really cool. So solid overall build from Vero here. Let's move on to the second last mock in this color scheme episode. It's by Patron. Man, I always get your name wrong. I wholeheartedly apologize. Patron. That's how I'm going to say it. And if I've said it wrong, I'm sorry. Anyway, this mock is called Nimbus. So I think this was kind of a very different example of white, and that's why I wanted to include it. The qualities that I think the white kind of communicates on this mock is a sense of purity, a bit of innocence, a sense of light and brilliance at the same time. So to me, I sort of saw this character because he kind of has these sort of larger wheels at the back of his legs there that I assume sort of move down, and he's sort of this kind of racer character. Instead of needing a car to race, he just sort of races on his wheel feet instead, which I think is a great idea, and I've always really liked that idea for Bionicle characters as a whole. I think I've spoken about that in the past in kind of older Biss episodes, but I've just always thought it was a really cool aesthetic. But what I like about this is that the white and teal and yellow, which, by the way, fantastic color combination, here it starts to look more like kind of racing stripes or a color scheme that you might find on some sort of racing car, all sorts of stuff like that. And I like that this character isn't some angel or angelic ethereal character or isn't some sort of weird scientific creation that uses white to sort of symbolize that it's all sterile and all that. No, instead, the white showcases this guy's personality. I like to think that this guy in the racing circuit, there's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of bad guys who cheat the system. They bet on other people and they win lots of money and blah. But this guy, he's just here for the thrill of the race. He likes to have fun. He likes to play by the book. He likes to do the right thing. So I like that the color scheme maybe can symbolize an element of his personality in that regard. Actually, let me read the description. Maybe. I apologize. I didn't read the description before I started to speak about this mock. Maybe it actually says exactly that. Let's find out. Maybe I'm entirely wrong. The description says, a racing robot built for speed with an inexplicable preference for rocky and desert terrain. Okay, that's pretty cool. So, I was right in saying that he's a racer, but doesn't necessarily mention his personality. So, I'm applying my own artistic interpretation to this mock and giving him a personality based on the colors that I'm seeing, which, I should get to know the guy before I just blatantly assume something about him. But, for the example of this episode, that's what we'll assume. And, little extra morsel there, how he was saying he's sort of got this, preference for rocky and desert terrain. Maybe you could argue that the white in his color scheme sort of gives him this sense of being sort of very fresh and clean and, refined, like kind of fresh off the assembly line, So you could kind of get this sense that he's very state of the art. It's like when you buy a new Apple product and it's all shiny and, sometimes they're like black or silver, but, sometimes Apple products can be white and it's all shiny and new, Maybe it's a bit like that. Like he's state of the art and it's this brand new piece of technology. It's amazing, So a couple little more vastly different ways that you could interpret white as a color, whether that's a sense of personality behind the character or the sort of essence that it communicates about their occupation, level of experience, all that sort of stuff. I think it's pretty cool. I think it's really cool indeed. Some little elements about this mock that I really like. I really like the hand design. Using some of those old Mutta hand pieces that you saw on like Pahatu and Tahu and Liwa, but instead adding some newer pieces to them, some of those more posable kind of fingers that he's got there with some of those clips to clip them in that fashion, really helps to kind of modernize that design, which I really, really like. It's just a very different hand design that you don't really see every day. And so just really fitting and a really cool way to give life to a very sort of old design, that's for sure. Again, too, I just love the... I really like the fact that his wheels sort of fold down and he has these little sort of silver feet there that they can kind of be a bit more temporary. Because it makes sense that if this character always had wheels on his feet, that, I don't know, that might get a bit tiring or it might be a bit harder to just sort of walk around at a sort of slower pace. So I like the fact that they kind of flip up and down depending on whether he's actually racing or he's just, out having lunch and he, doesn't need his wheels at this time. I think that's just a very practical, very smart way of doing that. It's cool. It's cool indeed. So yeah, great little fantastic mock here, which uses white in some more distinct and different ways. Very nicely done. And finally, let's move on to a mock by Awesomeness Born, and it's called the Beldum. So what I wanted to speak about with this, we spoke about being, angelic or having elements of good and niceness to you if you have this, you're white in the color scheme of a mock. But here's an example of a mock that is a lot more sort of sinister in nature, a lot more kind of evil in its overall look. But it still uses white, and yet, we spoke about how white can be this sort of symbol of purity and being angelic in nature. But that's not really what it's doing here. And you know what? That's fine. Because, hey, skeletons are white. They definitely are not angelic or, some skeletons I'm sure are good. Let's not judge a skeleton based on how the media might portray them. But, I like to also remind you that, hey, just because a color can represent or symbolically showcase one specific element or thing, or the vast majority of the mocks that we spoke about today have sort of similar things that they're communicating with the choice of white in their color scheme, you can still use white in a mock and it not communicate that at all. Or you can just build whatever you want and not have to pay attention to what the color specifically means. Always important to remember that, I think. And also important to remember too that skeletons are white, and heck, build as many skeletons as you want because skeletons are really super cool. So yeah, this is this mock here. I really like it. And it definitely, like I said, has this more sinister look to it. And I think that's also conveyed through the very sort of long limbs that it's got, how they're way longer than they should be for a typical humanoid. It does just give it this sort of more creepy kind of monster-like look to it. Also the additions of this very sort of sinister kind of ballroom dress. It's like something you would see on a female supervillain. That they just have this sort of evil kind of regal look to them, or this sort of very fanciful look to them that, I don't know, it's just sort of unhinging and a little bit creepy, and like they have this great sense of power and wealth and that they could crush you, think it's very cool, and it's nice to see that being conveyed with some of those net elements, different cape elements, and also just in general kind of blocking the colors in a manner to represent that she is wearing a dress, you know? It's really, really cool. It's really, really fitting and just really well-built mock. So, that's it for this color scheme episode, and that's it for the color of white. I probably should have said this up top, but I just saw it in my notes, and so I want to touch upon it here, of course. I just showed you one definition of what white can symbolize. Of course, culturally, white can symbolize a whole bunch of different stuff, you know? And that can be the same with every single color, you know? In one place, it could mean one thing, in another place, it could mean something else. Or, you know, depending on what you partner with that color, it can communicate something entirely different, you know? So I think it's always really important to remember that you know, the symbolic meaning that I say a color can have is not representative of its full scope and general meaning, you know? Because it's like that. Green can mean sort of sickly and evil, but green can also mean nature and in a nice sense of kind of positive and freshness, you know? So there's all sorts of spectrums and different levels and things behind colors. So, hey, you know, do a bit of research if you really want to look into some of the meanings behind colors, because there's quite a rich history there for sure. Anyway, that's it for this episode of the Bionicle Inspiration series. If you really enjoyed this episode, head to the links in the description. You can see some of the mocks that we spoke about today in the description. You can see some of the other stuff that these builders have done, and you can continue to have that enjoyment in other places, seeing the other things that they've made. Additionally, there's links in the description to some of my social media, so if you want to check out some of the stuff I've done, it's there for you. And if you want to see your own mocks on the show, you can submit them to the email you're currently seeing on your screen. It's also in the description below if you want to copy and paste that as you send the email. All you got to put in the email is images, any sort of information that you want to put in. It's completely up to you. Yeah, submit away. And once you've submitted it, I'll put it on the list, and one day it'll appear on the show. Don't worry about what the next theme for the episode is. Just submit whatever you've got. I'll make an episode around it. All right, thank you very much for listening, guys. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now.